at all. Thank you for the invitation. My name's Lisa Wainwright. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at the Sport and Recreation Lines, which some people may know as the old CCPR, the Central Council for Physical Recreation. The most important thing about me is I'm mummy taxi. So I have two daughters, age 11 and 12, who swim. So I am very much mummy taxi, basically. I've had a whole career in the sport and recreation sector, of which I absolutely love, and have gained so many friendships and support along that way and along the journey.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure for you to be part of the 45 Strong and explore a question I've been asking myself all my life, pretty much, which is, we'll start straight up with, what does being strong mean to you?
Well, you know what? When you sent me the questions, I thought, let me just think through this, because I hadn't really thought about it, a bit like you just said. So I went to Google and thought, right, I'm going to get a definition. And I kind of pulled up, able to withstand force, pressure, or wear, or powerful and difficult to resist or defeat. So very, very grand words. But what does it mean to me? I think what strong means to me is being you and understanding yourself. And by understanding yourself, you will demonstrate whatever strength means to you or to people who are receiving that behavior, if that makes sense. Because I think you could determine it in so many different ways. So, of course, it's powerful. Of course, at times you need to be resilient. But I did find it was difficult to resist or defeat. I thought that was incredible in terms of kind of a scientific type of approach. But for me, I would say being strong, and what does it mean to me? It's about being yourself, sticking to your values, and knowing what those values are. And I think, many people don't quite understand what their values are until they work through it. And once you've done that, once you know what your values are and you stick to them, for me, that's the definition of strength.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I think there's a lot of gold in that resonates, and it sounds a lot experiential, which ties nicely into the second question, which is, can you share an experience where you had to be strong, and how did you handle that?
Yeah, there's lots I could talk through, but probably the one that if I had to write a book, which I won't because I don't write, but if I did, it would be around. I was chief exec of British basketball, and British basketball has for many, many years been an untapped sport in Britain. And when I became chief exec, we had no money and we had no staff, but we'd entered 6 teams into international competitions. I'm sorry, 8 teams into international competitions, so junior age groups to senior. And when I was asked to be chief exec, I should have said no, because you've got no money, you've got no staff, and there's a commitment to international competition, which costs a lot of money and reputational challenges. But I decided, because of my values, I absolutely believed that basketball, and still do believe today, that basketball as a sport can engage such a diverse variety of people into its community, far more reaching than many, many other activities. So I decided I'd do some research and found that it was one of the least funded sports for the reach that sport had. And then I started to unpick, well, why was that? And I started to realise basically there's a significant amount over 30 years of unconscious bias. And I would say racism. So what I had to try and do is to demonstrate that through evidence. But the reason I had to be strong was I was previously the head of sport at Sport England that took part in those decisions, that funded sports. I was also a director of the British Olympic Association at the time. So for me to say, I don't think funding regimes are right, etc., it's quite difficult to do. You have to be strong, because I believe that this sport had not been treated fairly. I believe that the community the sport could reach have not been treated fairly. And then this is, it'd be about 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years ago. But it was really tough because I was going against the sector. I was going against friends I'd worked with and colleagues for 30, 40 years. And it was a really tough time. I had to call on the International Federation to support me. I had to publicly state that the policy of the government was wrong to both Sport England, UK Sport, and the Sports Minister, Tracy Crouch. And it hit the press. And it hit the press at a time when it was completely out of my control, but it hit the press during the Winter Olympics. And you will know the perennial debate about winter sport receiving far too much money for 3 people on a bobsleigh. That's not my view, but that's how the press roll out this story. We should be funding more people in a sport like basketball compared to skeleton or whatever other winter sport they would choose. So it was huge, and I had to be strong because there was a lot of pressure from very senior people to telling me to step down, that my career would be over. Lots of people think that basketball is a basket case. I don't believe it is. I think the culture of the people that come through the sport are very different traditionally to British people. And I say that in those terms because maybe they're not as compliant as some of the other people in other sports. Maybe they are edgy. So anyway, the reason I talk about that as being strong, my career was at risk, my health was at risk. I had very few people around me, and reputationally I was at risk. But I knew it was the right thing to do. So I led the campaign to change the policy. We received the funding, we got the policy changed, and we were a very different world. But that's where the strongest I had to be as a leader, because I had to utilise volunteers to drive that forwards. I had to gain the trust of the players that I was doing the right thing, and I'm not a basketballer. So there was a huge amount of risk around that strength. And it was 2 very, very long, hard years. But as I say, a lot of people helped me and maintained me through that process. But it was a huge experience in terms of how to maintain strength, resilience, and focus in such a challenging environment.
Yeah, and it comes back to your original answer, which was about knowing your values. And it sounds like you had to put yourself almost on the line to be able to honour your values, and that is where the true strength came from.
Absolutely. I believe you should treat people fairly. You should enable and embrace difference and welcome it, not just respect it, but actually embrace it. And one should always act with integrity and call out where things are wrong. And often we don't do that. And that's a strength if you can call something out that you think is strong, regardless of the consequences. You know, I had 2, my daughters, I think at the time were 2 and 3. To have lost the job at that point would have been, you know, not the greatest thing from a mortgage perspective, but there were more important things and more important lives that could have been affected by the outcome.
Wow, that's really powerful. Well, thank you so much for sharing, and thank you for making the stand as well. And I'd like to pivot it slightly away and look at it on a sort of bigger picture. And how do you think societal expectation about women and the concept of strength play out?
Well, I'm not quite sure. Other than where many people associate the word strength and strong with men, to me, words aren't gendered. So I find it really hard. But I know within society, as you say, they often are. So, you know, a stereotypical word would be around being self-resilient, seem to be male, whereas for a feminist, I would be more nurturing than self-resilient. You would think about assertive for men, you would talk about agreeable for women. But I've never seen words in that way, and I've never treated people differently, whether they're male or female. I've tried not to, or non-binary. You treat an individual as an individual with every lived experience that person brings to you. Because when you're working across international federations, you'll meet different cultures that male and female have very different connotations compared to the British use of words of female and male. So I think for me, there are societal expectations around women around strength. But what I've tried to do, as I say, is continually challenge, and it shouldn't be about a gendered approach. It should be about skills, behaviours, and values that person encapsulates regardless of their gender.
Yeah, I think that's really important to say. And it's curious because everyone brings a different answer and perspective. So I'm just exploring it. And looking at the word strength, then, have you got any common misconceptions that you've encountered around that word?
I think I've often been called challenging, just challenging to work with. I've been called resilient, where I guess a man might have been called strong. I don't know. I don't think I've ever been called strong, you know. I was thinking through it, thinking, no, I've definitely been called challenging lots of times. I've been called difficult as well, which I'm sure I am. But those would be words I would wrap around strong. So I think there are some misconceptions about strength. But it's the perception of the person in terms of how they portray that. You know, for me, showing vulnerability is a strength. Most people wouldn't see that, but it's a huge strength to be authentic in yourself and share vulnerability. It's one of the strongest things you can do, actually, the most empowering things you can do. But most people would say if you're vulnerable, you're weak.
Yeah, and that's pretty much why I birthed this entire series, is because I did collapse not showing weakness and not showing emotion as the same. So yeah, it's thank you for highlighting that, because that's something that I have been challenged with and by regularly.
Yeah.
And with the filter of strength, has that influenced, or how has that influenced your approach to success and goal setting?
Yeah. So the word strength is really important to me, because when I meet an individual, it's really important that we understand their strengths. And many years ago, I was involved in a piece of work called Strength Scope, which identifies through 24 different strengths, and they're not gendered words; they're just 24 strengths in 4 areas: on emotional, relational, execution, and thinking. So those are 4 areas. And what it does is pulls out your strengths, and as an executive leader, it identifies where your strengths are, and it never looks at the other side of the gambit. So your strengths are your strengths, and you make them stronger. What you don't do is even consider your weaknesses from your perspective. What you do is you know them and you identify how you can find people to fulfill those weaknesses where you can't, because you cannot be all 24 strengths. It's impossible to be the top of your strength. So to bring that to life, so mine, which is interesting for me anyway, is around courage, which I guess is the strength I talked about in basketball, creativity, developing others. Most people, again, if you use the lenses, would call that nurturing, but developing others. And I'm an ex-teacher, so you might expect that to be in there. Enthusiasm is a strength to be able to drive people. Leading, relationship building, and self-improvement. So again, I use this tool, Strength Scope, all the time with all my staff, because what I try and do is blend a series of skills to bring the right team together that's balanced, rather than the saying about kicking a pig. So if a pig, you put some food in front of a pig and doesn't want to eat, you can kick its bottom, but it still won't eat, and you'll keep kicking its bottom and it still won't eat. So the outcome of that is you get a really poorly foot.
Mm.
You need to realize if somebody's not got that skill set, there's no point keep shouting, you're rubbish at budgets, you're absolutely crap at budgets. Some people just are not very good at budgets, like me. But what I am good at is identifying that I'm not good at budgets, but I know somebody who has, and they will be my right hand or left hand in terms of that. So strengths are absolutely critical in how I operate, and how I operate within a much broader environment, not just in my team, but when I meet people, is pulling out their strengths, because most people will start to open up fairly quickly if you talk about strengths.
Yeah, I'm finding that as well. It's getting conversations to different angles and different tangentials that would never normally arise, because we've met ourselves each other professionally, but we wouldn't have these conversations if it wasn't around the word strength. So thank you for that.
Completely.
And so from your own experience, like what tip or technique have you developed, or can you share with us about nurturing strength?
So I think I leaned to it earlier around Strength Scope, was around really spend time listening and observing to people, not a man, not a woman, not somebody who's non-binary. Just listen and observe that person. And the key thing for me in nurturing somebody is understanding their motivation. Every single person is different. You don't know what happened before they came to meet you that day. So to understand their motivation, and then for me, and this might be my swimming group, it might be people at work, it might be my friends, it might be my wife, is creating an environment to let them grow and strengthen their strengths. And one of the examples, maybe worth just to bring that to life, is when I worked at Sport England, I was told when I arrived I had to remove this chap because he was hopeless. And I hate people telling me that other people are hopeless, because that's my judgment, not their judgment. And I've never judged that anybody was hopeless, because we all have strengths in different areas. So I took it upon myself not just to listen to this person, and he lacked confidence because he had a stutter. And nobody at all had bothered to identify support, where the stuff came from, how he'd been treated, and everything. Anyway, so through 2 years, he was probably one of the best members of staff that's ever worked for me. He was quiet, he had a stutter, and he was so meticulous with his work. He's now a director in the industry, so I'm not going to give a name, but he's flown. But what it took was is building his self-confidence, because he had to own a room when he walked in, and he couldn't because of his stutter. And one of the things we talked through, and I got him a mentor, but one of the things we talked through was about there's no one more youer than you. It's a Dr. Seuss quote, and said, what is it that you've done? When you walk in a room, nobody would have done it. Nobody will have an idea. And he went, well, I've done the Marathon des Sables. I said, I'm sorry? He said, yeah, I did the Marathon des Sables. I said, oh my word. tell me about it. And he told me about the blisters on the blisters on the blisters. I said, every time you go into a room, the first thing you're going to talk about to anybody is the marathon disabler, because that gives you confidence, you own the room. And from that, and a lot of coaching and mentoring, he controlled his stutter. You wouldn't even know he's got a stutter now. So he's in a director role. He's absolutely flown. But his motivation was to do a good job. But just because he was quiet and he had a stutter didn't mean he was doing a bad job. And I think that's about, my experience of nurturing strength is understanding motivations. It's like a gardener, and then creating the right environment for your flowers to blossom. That's really arty-farty fairy, but that's in essence what you do and what I do. And that's the job as a leader. And I take responsibility for that with anyone I would encounter.
I absolutely adore that. And I think it's resonant in every level of life, especially potentially nowadays, because there is this polarizing, you're either with us or against us. If we just sat in the middle with open curiosity of what drives you, quite possibly there'd be a lot less angst and animosity in the world today.
And nobody's right. What drives you is what drives you. And we can argue about nurture or nature, but it's what drives you. You're not going to change it because it's fundamental to who you are.
Yeah, I wholly see it. And I love adding an element of curiosity. So the last question is actually the first again. And so what does being strong mean to you?
It's being strong meaning to me. I love the word curiosity, by the way. Being strong to me is being myself. And I know I'm strong if I'm being myself and I'm acting authentically. And I think there's a quote about be yourself. After all, there's no one else more qualified. I think it's an Oscar Wilde quote. But that for me is absolutely critical. Is that's what strength means to me, is being happy with yourself and being yourself.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for your time today and sharing so authentically what you've experienced and how strength turns up to you. I've found it immensely interesting to get to know you better, but also as a reflection into my own life. So yeah, thank you so much for your time.
It's